Good afternoon. I'm Dave Booker, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I want to welcome you to the first of our year-long virtual seminar series. The goal of this series is to showcase the great work our college faculty, students, and staff do to address the critical challenges of our time. For the first in our series, we will focus on understanding the pandemic. For all of 2020, we have had to learn about a new virus called SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, often called coronavirus. Before we get started, I want to let you know that you can ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The outstanding panel I've assembled today will help us understand the pandemic from several different perspectives. I want to begin with Dr. Tapprich. Dr. Bill Tapprich is Professor of Biology and serves as the Sophie and Fyodora Kahn Professor of Biology, and he currently serves as Interim Chair of the Department of Chemistry. His areas of research focus on molecular biology, virology, and nucleic acids biochemistry. He will discuss with us the science of COVID-19. Bill, we've been hearing a lot about COVID-19 since January, but I'm not sure that many of us understand the science of this virus. I read that there are 800 million viruses on every square meter of Earth every day, that there are 320,000 different viruses that affect mammals, and 219 virus strains known to infect humans. So before we begin discussing COVID, I want to begin with a broader question. What are viruses? And what's the difference between a good virus and a bad virus?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm really proud to be a part of this distinguished group of faculty members, and I really look forward to learning from everyone during this discussion. I have some very simple answers to that question, and then I'll develop them a little more. A virus is really very simple. A virus is an infectious agent. Really, its only goal, its only objective is to enter a host cell and multiply. As I'm sure you've seen models of viral particles, and you can see that they're really very simple. For example, the viral particle that is the virus that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2. As you've seen, the viral particles look very simple and they're very small. The virus that causes COVID looks like a spiky ball. It's a sphere. It's about 200 times smaller than a human cell and about 10 times smaller than a bacterial cell. Like all viruses, the particle has very simple construction. It has a very small genome. It doesn't have very many genes, and it's surrounded and protected by a protein coat, and that's encased in a membrane called an envelope. The SARS-CoV-2 only has 12 genes. Oftentimes, I ask the class that I teach about virology, if you only had 12, what would you use them for? You know, and I have responses such as, well, of course, one would be football watching, the other might be beer drinking, but now I've already used 2 of my 12 genes. And so it's important to understand that viruses have very small genomes with a very small number of genes, and so they have to be simplistic. They're simple, they're small, but they are mighty. They're called parasitic genomes. They use the molecules on their surface, the spiky bits, to attach to host cells and deliver their genome into a host cell. The genome then uses cellular machinery to make viral components that will then assemble into a brand new virus and escape from the cell. They do this in thousands of times within a host cell so that they will release thousands of viral progeny. Oftentimes, when the virus releases its viral progeny, it kills the cell, and that cell killing leads to damage of the tissue, and that's what causes disease. Viruses then, after they've been released from a cell, will attach to neighboring cells and go through the same process where they make more of themselves, escape, and destroy the cell. You know, viruses have very important differences from other infectious agents, such as bacteria, fungi, protozoan, parasites. Since they don't have machinery of their own, they have to depend fully on the machinery of their host cell. That means if you try to kill the virus in an infected cell, you also kill the cell. So if you kill the virus, you kill the host, and that's not a good outcome. That's one reason that it's so difficult to develop antiviral compounds or antiviral drugs.
Thank you, Bill. And so getting to COVID now, what is COVID-19 and why is it more diabolical than most viruses? And why is it the most successful infectious disease perhaps in the last 100 years?
Yeah, you asked why, what makes a virus a good virus or a bad virus, and believe it or not, there are some good viruses. I won't go into describing them because they are few and far between. Most of them are bad viruses. COVID is a very bad virus. COVID is indeed, the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, is indeed a very bad virus. COVID is the disease that is caused by the viral infection of SARS-CoV-2. As you probably heard, COVID cases have a wide range of severity. They go from very mild or even asymptomatic or undetectable to very serious, requiring hospitalization or even deadly. And that's one of the diabolical natures of COVID is you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if you're going to get a very mild infection. Maybe you have an infection and you don't even know it. Or are you going to get a very serious infection that requires hospitalization? So COVID is diabolical for a number of other reasons as well. Clinically, in severe cases, it causes failure in several organ systems, primarily respiratory. So primarily, the disease is a respiratory disease. From the point of view of the infection itself, the virus that causes COVID, called SARS-CoV-2, stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. As the name suggests, the virus is a coronavirus. Some may not know that coronaviruses are very common in the human population. They circulate constantly in the human population and they cause the common cold. Generally, coronaviruses are not that serious. However, the one that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, is a brand new strain of coronavirus that infects humans easily. It multiplies easily and it causes a large amount of damage in human tissues. Like other viruses that suddenly come into the human population from another mammal or another animal, SARS-CoV-2 causes a very serious disease. They're called emerging viruses, viruses that are suddenly introduced into the human population. Those kinds of viruses, the population has no immunity. They have no history with that virus. And so it usually causes very severe disease. COVID is one of those. Good examples include HIV. Good examples of coronaviruses that have jumped into the human population are SARS and MERS. SARS came in 2002, MERS came in 2012, but neither of those became pandemic.
And so just to clarify, you said the common cold, you mentioned the common cold. We often hear that people try to compare COVID to the flu, but this is not the flu.
You're absolutely right about that. Let me start with, this is not the flu. SARS-CoV-2 and influenza are completely different viruses. They are not the same. They are not constructed the same. They don't have the same features in their multiplication cycle. So they are not the same viruses and they don't cause the same overall disease. One of the important differences, and I want to make this as probably the most important difference currently, the mortality of SARS-CoV-2 is between 3 and 4%. The mortality of currently circulating influenza strains is about 0.1%. That means you're 30 to 40 times more likely to die from SARS-CoV-2 than you are from influenza. So the disease processes have very different potential outcomes. With that said, so they are very different, and as viruses, they behave very differently. But with that said, clinically, there are many similarities between COVID and between SARS-CoV-2 and influenza. Both cause respiratory diseases that can be deadly. Both are transmitted by respiratory droplets or by contact with surfaces. And both can be transmitted by asymptomatic individuals. However, with all these similarities, when you look at details, the evidence suggests that most strains of influenza are not as easily transmitted as SARS-CoV-2. And most strains of influenza do not attack the lower respiratory tract in the way that SARS-CoV-2 attacks the lower respiratory tract. And so the disease can be more severe with SARS-CoV-2.
Thank you, Bill. Finally, there's the whole, we've been living this now for months and months. And I think we're going to get to the issue of the social distancing in a few minutes, but we're all hoping for some kind of solution to this. One, I know Sweden has tried herd immunity, and I know that sometimes we hear attempting, it's come out recently that, they're thinking about herd immunity for this country. What is herd immunity? And then we have an audience question that any idea when a vaccine might be available, and will it be safe?
Yeah, let me address the herd immunity idea, because this one frightens me a bit. Herd immunity refers to a threshold of immune individuals in a population where there are not enough susceptible individuals to support continued transmission. So transmission ends because there are so many that are immune to that virus that it can't find new hosts. That's the idea behind herd immunity. The threshold for herd immunity depends upon the virus. For measles, for example, requires 95% of the population to be immune in order to attain herd immunity. SARS-CoV-2, it's been estimated, requires 70% of the population to be immune in order to attain herd immunity. Now, herd immunity can be conferred by a combination of vaccine and infection. So you don't have to wait until everybody's infected if you have a vaccine. So with a vaccine, you can combine that with the number of people infected to get to your threshold. Let's just say you want to get to herd immunity with SARS-CoV-2 using just infection. Well, if you do the math, given a mortality of 3%, 70% infection will cause 7 million deaths in the United States. That's why I think herd immunity is not a good approach unless there's a vaccine supporting the herd immunity. The good news about vaccines is, by and large, this is a global effort. There are currently 169 candidate vaccines that are in development. 26 of them are in human trials. There are 4 vaccines that are now in phase 3 clinical human trials. One that was just announced this morning. So I think that the vaccine front is very promising. One of the things I love about the vaccine front is that every possible approach is being taken. Good old-fashioned approaches like killed viruses or inactivated viruses, like the polio vaccine, like smallpox vaccine, those are being developed, as well as new molecular approaches like DNA vaccines or plasmid vaccines or replicating viral vector vaccines or messenger RNA vaccines. Those are also being developed. So there are many candidates. My best guess is the same best guess that you see on television. I'm thinking that these phase 3 clinical trials are going to tell us whether there's an effective vaccine by the end of the year, and then rollout and distribution will take well into 2021. That's my best.
Thank you. One more question, and then we'll very quickly, Bill. We have a question from Dr. Riles. Bill says it's respiratory, but I've also read it may be more of a vascular disease. Do you think there's? Do you think that's true?
I tried to keep it simple. This virus attacks many tissues. Cardiac tissue, for example, vascular tissue, for example. The receptor that lets this virus into cells is found all over the body. So there are many systems involved. It's the respiratory one that seems to be most deadly.
Thank you. Now I want to bring in Dr. Kelly MacArthur, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She is a medical sociologist and has written about the challenges of social distancing resulting in what she has called an epidemic of loneliness. The idea of herd immunity, Kelly, as the way to combat COVID introduces the idea of social immunity. Kelly, I read one article about why people continue to deny the pandemic with so much information about the severity of the coronavirus. Why do some people still refuse to accept advice against wearing masks and social distancing? And from your perspective as a sociologist, what are your thoughts on social immunity?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I enjoy the opportunity to point the finger towards social relationships at any chance I get. And so the resistance to masks and quarantines, and when a vaccine is released, we will see the same type of resistance. And one of the reasons that I think that we could focus on is because it goes against our nature to be social. So quarantining goes again, we really want to connect with other human beings, and that prevents us from doing that as much as we would like to. Even masks, it's not a reason not to wear them, but even masks restrict social interaction and the connection that you can make. And then once a vaccine is released, whether or not people will actually accept that vaccine will depend on social trust. So just general trust in people, as well as trust in institutions such as government. And these levels of trust have been decreasing over time, alongside other similar measures like social solidarity. And so we're going to see some issues with resistance to the vaccine because of social, aside from the safety and efficacy issues, we'll see some resistance because of social reasons as well.
This question came in. I think I know what the answer is, but I think I would like to hear you, and if anybody else wants to weigh in. Might mask wearing in everyday life become normalized when COVID-19 is no longer a threat? And I'm thinking airlines, for example. I'm not thinking we might be wearing them all over, but there are specific places where, are there specific places where it might become normalized?
Well, like so many things, we have to wait and see. We're not sure how the pandemic is going to affect our relationships with each other long term, and we're going to have to see. But I think that it'll be interesting. And another thing too is our culture. We already, compared to some other cultures, as far as physical space, we don't touch a lot, and some of these other things, and so wearing masks might restrict that a little more, again, right, and kind of like compromise our ability to connect. And any infectious disease brings up fear of contagion, and so masks might be one of the ways that we don't fully recover and get back to connecting with each other.
So another related question to masks just came in.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, yes.
So also, I'm talking later, but thank you.
This is Dr. Timi Barone. She'll be talking in a few minutes.
Okay, so I'm the anthropologist on the panel. And so let me just dovetail with what Dr. MacArthur was saying. I think if we look at, for example, parts of Southeast Asia, many people are familiar with the fact that it's pretty common for folks in urban areas in Japan and China to wear masks. It's really actually pretty common. It's seen as a way of maintaining one's own health. There definitely is an element of the collective in terms of, we've all heard that, I wear a mask to protect you, you wear a mask to protect me, which is certainly true. But I think we could see some normalization of this, in part because in the United States, the culture does have a significant emphasis on health and fitness. And so I think it may really depend on who continues to wear a mask. And I don't know if Kelly wants to comment on that, but because of that emphasis on health and fitness and maintaining one's self appropriately, we might see masks catch on here too for those reasons.
Yeah, so go ahead, I'm sorry.
So there's two opposing forces at work. You can wear a mask for the other people and for the social good and for solidarity. And if that fails, as it is likely to, that in the US anyway, then what might, as Dr. Barone is saying, then our individualistic, never-ending quest to be healthy might make us wear masks instead. Yeah, so that's an interesting point.
Okay, so Dr. MacArthur, in late March, you published a Midlands Voice article in the Omaha World Herald, and now you have a forthcoming article, congratulations, called
treating loneliness in the aftermath of a pandemic, threat or opportunity, in which you talk about what you call an epidemic of loneliness. Can you tell us what you mean by this, by an epidemic of loneliness, and how the coronavirus is contributing to this social epidemic?
Yeah, well, so I'm certainly not the one to coin the term epidemic of loneliness, but I use it in quotes because not everyone agrees that it should be conceptualized as an epidemic. Those, academic debates aside, we could say that we'll use the word crisis instead. There has been a crisis of loneliness well before the pandemic hit, in which people, like a quarter of people, over a quarter really, report chronically feeling lonely and disconnected. And so when the pandemic hit, of course, and we have distancing guidelines, I prefer to call it distancing or physical distancing just to not undermine the importance of social relationships. People became worried that it was going to exacerbate what was already going on in terms of loneliness. I was drawn to the issue because I think it's really interesting how loneliness affects not just mental health, but also physical health in really extreme ways, and basically every health outcome, including mental health, so things like depression, which is not the same as loneliness, although they're related, and dementia, and so cognitive and mental, but also it shortens life expectancy and is related to cardiovascular disease and all of the other main methods of mortality across the globe. And one of the catchy things that people might see is that the physical effects on health of loneliness are the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, or to being medically considered to be obese. And those are pretty, large numbers, I think, and that warrant a greater attention to the role of our relationships in health. And so when we have to distance, and we don't know if that's going to be long-term or not, what effect is distancing and quarantining going to have on our health? And I think, and I argue that it could get worse. And I think just the studies are just coming out now, like within the last month, a few studies, and some of them show that loneliness has gotten worse since the pandemic, especially among older folks. And then other studies show that it is leveled out. And so I don't want to jump to the conclusion that seems obvious that we might be experiencing more loneliness, because in fact, and lots of you know this personally, anecdotally, that people are really finding a way to compensate. And, so you're Zooming or having Zoom happy hours, or, doing all these things and making effort because, that you might not have made. So it could be helping. And so it goes on the large pile of things that we don't quite know yet.
Right. So just following up on that, we've heard a lot about the pandemic impacting the elderly because it's particularly dangerous to them. A recent CDC report showed that 1 in 4 people between the ages of 18 and 24 have started increased substance abuse to cope since the pandemic started, substantially higher than in other age groups. As one teenager put it, the life you thought was boring is the life you're hoping to get back to. So you talk about what's happening now. What do you see as the potential long-term consequences of these social disruptions on social relationships?
Well, I mean, substance use is a specific and tricky issue because it involves addiction. Because with all of these things, whether it's loneliness or any of the effects of loneliness on health, the key is to have it not be chronic and not be long-term. So, this isn't the best answer, but again, we kind of have to wait and see to see what our new normal is going to be with relationships. And some people are going to come out of it with, new addictions and new patterns of social behavior that will affect their health. And so we'll also have to see, how this affects our institutions like healthcare and education and government.
Right. And so we have a question and this could be answered by any of you as professors. Are you hearing from students specifically about the effects of COVID on their mental health and learning at this point?
Absolutely. And, it's just like everyone, even people who are not experiencing, a full on, issue, there's just this background, thing that is keeping them down or keep inhibiting people's ability to concentrate. And I would argue that one of the main reasons for that, again, is social, and that we're not being able to fulfill, one of our most important basic needs, which is to be social and to feel connected to others, which is also compromised by social and political divisions.
And another question, you mentioned Zoom. What's the best way for people to connect during the pandemic besides Zoom? Are there ways that do you have advice for people trying to look for ways to connect besides Zoom?
I don't have advice because I think that the main problem is much broader than on the individual level. I think that loneliness and disconnection that existed before the pandemic is mostly due to our values that I like to borrow the term from the journalist Johan Hari, who says that Western countries have what he calls junk values, which is like analogous to junk food, that we are drawn to these things like individualism and materialism and consumerism. If you like this idea of self-care has actually been, it's become so individualized. So if you think of self-care, you think of maybe buying something. And in the short term, we think that those things are going to help. And then they actually don't, because we're chasing the wrong values. A fascinating study that shows this is that I think it's like Russia and Japan, it's survey research, and it shows that when people in those countries pursue happiness, they do in fact become happier. But when people in the US pursue happiness, their happiness actually gets worse. And so the authors attribute that to Western countries, people in Western countries chasing the wrong values, so I think that's the overall problem. So to be a pessimistic sociologist, I don't have any advice on the individual level, although things like Zoom, happy hours and stuff like that can certainly, or television or pets, all those things that can keep you physically safe, they can, in the short term, compensate, what are called parasocial relationships.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you very much. Finally, I want to introduce Dr. Timi Barone, who you've met already. She is associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She is a medical anthropologist who studies health and health disparities and the role of healing arts in biomedical environments. And Mr. Steve Langan serves as director of UNO's Medical Humanities program. Together, Dr. Barone and Mr. Langan are teaching a course this semester called Pandemics. Wonder how you thought of that. Designed to help students understand how humans respond to pandemics and how individuals, cultures, and societies are affected by pandemics. So let me bring you into this conversation, Timi. You study health disparities and social determinants of health. What do you mean by these, and how are these things playing out during this pandemic?
Well, thanks again for inviting me to participate, and thanks to my colleagues. So when I think about health disparities, I think about this idea of who gets sick and why. And so, for example, if we're talking about the COVID-19 outbreak, we could be looking at who gets sick. Most of us know that there are presumably some biological differences that affect why the disease is more lethal in older populations. But if we look at how the outbreak is actually playing out in terms of mortality, we don't necessarily see that infection and illness and death are occurring in the same way for all populations in the United States. And so looking at those social aspects to this very biological outbreak it contributes to health disparities. So what do I mean by that? So for example, we know that there is a disparity in terms of risk of death if you contract the virus, depending on your race. And so what we see is mortality is higher in Black populations in the United States than it is in white populations. Actually, in communities of color in general, we see a disparity between, so if you think about it, everybody gets the virus, and then what happens? Who lives and who dies? Age may play a role in that, absolutely, but we see disparities between communities. And so that's just one example, and you can do this for pretty much any health condition in the United States. We see disparities between populations in how they experience an illness and the outcomes that occur, how sick they get, their likelihood of dying. Now, some of that, usually Americans immediately go, it's access to healthcare. And absolutely, access to healthcare plays a big role. And for students listening to this, you have played that game, many of you probably, to try to decide, when do you decide to seek help? When do you decide to seek care? Because it's going to cost you in money and it's going to cost you in time. And you have to make that calculus. So there is also absolutely an economic aspect to this. But there's some other things going on, because disparities, we social scientists, and Dr. MacArthur could certainly weigh in on this as well. We also know that when you actually seek care, there may be bias in treatment. And to a large extent, this is unconscious bias, because we are humans and we live in American society, and we have been socialized in many cases with ideas about how different populations work. And we're sort of exposed to this if we think about things like stereotypes. But think about this. So two people present with the same disease and they seek care. We can see evidence of bias in medicine, unconscious bias, in some cases, how they're treated. So there are plenty of studies that suggest, for example, that Black people are less likely to have their symptoms being taken seriously. And this is true generally, and we can see it actually, there's some very preliminary information to suggest that this occurs when they're seeking treatment for the coronavirus in the current outbreak as well. Now, there's a third thing that's going on, and that is that living as a person of color in American society, because of the experience of discrimination, adds an extra layer of stress operating on your body. And long-term exposure to chronic stress can just tremendously wreak havoc and weaken the way that your body functions. Students and former students, think about how your body feels around finals time, right? Where that stress, it just drags on you, right? And you may swing from sort of anxiety to exhaustion. So imagine that you have a baseline of that operating every single day. And that's what happens to people of color in the United States. And that stress over time, that long-term stress, our bodies just aren't ready to handle it. And it doesn't even have to be something you experience personally. There's work by an anthropologist by the name of Lance Gravely that suggests that having someone in your social network, going back to Kelly's comments about relationships, that someone in your social network experiencing discrimination and talking to you about it can actually increase your stress level and increase your risk for things like hypertension. I think I hit everything.
I think Dr. Barone's comments, as always, are so illuminating and clarifying and relate and pertain to this working toward vaccine. Now, I would suggest, who cares if there's a vaccine if huge segments of the population believe that they'll be neglected, or that they will, that there is a conspiracy or a set of conspiracies in place that will leave them out of receiving this vaccine. And I think these disparities that she mentions are more important than ever. And the context that humanities scholars and artists and our social scientist colleagues can bring to this evolving moment is so important. I'm thinking about various departments and disciplines. Certainly, Asian American studies would have a role to play, Black studies, Latino studies, but history has a role, philosophy has a role, bioethics as a branch of philosophy has a role, the arts have a role in this. And it's going to take a collective unit to make sure that the vaccine that's coming our way is applicable to all in their minds, in reality, of course, but in their minds. And that's the re-education that I believe people in the health humanities are a part of right now and need to be a part of.
Thank you, Steve. So, Timi, you and Steve are teaching this course called Pandemics. Tell us about the course and what can we learn about our experience during our pandemic, I call it our pandemic, from the experiences of other societies that have had to work through their own pandemic. Talk about that, and then I'll ask you a question about 1918.
Okay. So we decided to put on this class in part because I, as a medical anthropologist, one of the things that I'm interested in is the interface between the biological and the cultural. And I guess the way to think about that is that social decisions may have biological consequences. And so, for example, going to this idea of herd immunity or vaccinations, these things have these choices have biological consequences. So epidemics are one way, and pandemics are one way to look at that unfolding in real time. Because, for example, one of the things that we have sort of anchored this class on is a cross-cultural model that looks at social responses to epidemics. And so generally what we see when we look across time and place, humans are relatively consistent in some of the patterns that emerge. And some of those decisions have greater or lesser consequences. So the first thing that happens when a pathogen enters, like the Black Death or 1918 or HIV/AIDS or the COVID-19 outbreak, these are the 4 pandemics we're looking at actually in the class, is the first thing is everybody's like, oh, people are getting sick, we'll just handle it like we normally handle things. And then if deaths continue, everybody kind of goes to more extraordinary responses. And there, in some cases, may be like an ostracism of people who are sick. You know, you're sick, I'm staying away from you. In some cases, that's full-fledged flight. Flee the area because people are dropping dead. That's a pretty normal response. Sometimes you have issues with rejection of authority, going back to what Dr. MacArthur was talking about. This is especially problematic if you don't have a lot of trust in authority figures to begin with, but like you see this when you study pandemics across time and place, and epidemics across time and place, is when the normal ways of solving problems in a society aren't working, it's pretty common to sort of say, well, that structure isn't working, we're going to reject authority. And when that happens, then a whole lot of other things can fall apart and you can descend into intra-group conflict. So we're looking at, for those patterns, as well as some others, including things like hope and cooperation as well, across these 4 pandemics. So the Black Death, the 1918 outbreak, HIV/AIDS, and then COVID-19.
Okay, so about 1918, and we've got a question about Omaha. So how is Omaha's response to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic compared to our 2020 response? And go ahead and answer that, and I'll do a follow-up from the audience here.
Okay, so in some ways, so a couple of things about 1918. So 1918 actually was a pretty rapid, lethal outbreak in the United States. So it actually moves really quickly. The most lethal part was actually in late September, early October through November. So about 24 days of very high morbidity and mortality. So lots of people getting sick and dying. So we know some about it, but you also have to know that the First World War was going on too. But in general, what we can see from what folks in 1918 left behind for us is Omaha, much like now in the current outbreak, was kind of slow to respond, but it was also kind of slow for the pathogen to get here. And so we were sort of slow to respond, and our quarantine, because it would have been quarantine at that point, was, you know, less than total. We didn't have sort of the large social campaigns and activations like we saw in a city like San Francisco or Philadelphia. And so it's kind of interesting that we see some similarities with the COVID-19 outbreak, that we have been sort of, the pathogen showed up here a little bit later, and maybe we've had the opportunity to learn from other communities.
So as a follow-up, and this question could be asked to all of you. So when we think about Omaha and the current concerns, this question has to do with what is the current. Is there a current biggest concern in Omaha right now? Is it mental health? Is it racial disparities? Is it stigma? Is it denial? Or is it all of those things all wrapped up, you know, into one?
Can I start, and then I can see Kelly's thinking, so maybe she'll want to join in. So I think, and Bill might have comments about this. I know that one concern right now has to do with influenza outbreaks potentially this fall. And it's not that I'm certainly not hearing, and I'm going to defer to the virologist on that, but I'm certainly not hearing anything that would suggest that we're due for a highly lethal round of flu. But influenza, complications from influenza, you know, often constitute a significant number of hospitalizations. And one of the areas of concern is what would be difficult for healthcare resources is if we have a moderate outbreak of COVID, if COVID increases in, there are more people needing hospitalization from COVID along with a fairly typical flu season. So I know that's one big concern.
Anyone else?
Let me just comment on what Dr. Barone just said. And yes, there's great fear that there's going to be a dual outbreak in flu season. There's a little bit of positive news from the Southern Hemisphere on that regard. And I don't know that it's going to play out the same here. But in the Southern Hemisphere, which has just been through its flu season, flu was almost non-existent. And so the distancing and the mask wearing and the things that we're doing to try to prevent transmission of SARS-CoV-2 seems to be also tamping down the flu.
Thank you. So, Steve, let's see. The course you're teaching includes, I'm assuming, many students who plan to be healthcare providers in the future. Why is it important that these future healthcare providers take such a course? And Kelly, I'm sure you want to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, some of our students in medical humanities, 3,000 pandemics, are practicing their craft right in front of us. I'm thinking, Dr. Barone, about our epidemiologist in training, our pre-med person in training. And it's wonderful to have that opportunity. The part that I'm charged with, by way of Dr. Barone, is helping to provide what literature does, what all of the arts do, what the humanities do, which is a feeling around these various subjects and themes. It's tough to take on something like pandemic. It's tough to take on climate change. It's easier to take on a mood, even a contradictory mood. And that's what the poem can do so well. There's so many examples of literature changing our lives. In 1948, Shirley Jackson publishes her poem, The Lottery, in the New Yorker, and it's about scapegoating. And I don't know if our culture ever really knew what scapegoating was until an artist came in to really, really do that work. So with these students, we're looking at poetry. We're thinking, but we're also deeply feeling these different moves and movements together. Because we know from watching healthcare education, and Dr. MacArthur will tell us more because she studies this in depth, that there is a loss of feeling and a loss of meaning all along the way, every single rung. And with that comment, I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Well, I'd like to begin by saying I don't want to dismiss all the different types of allied healthcare workers and different types of healthcare professionals. It's just that my own research focuses pretty exclusively on medical students. So doctors are the ones that I know the most about. So that's what I would talk about. And so again, we'll have to see how everything plays out, but the culture that medical students are trained in doesn't really allow for a lot of humanism. And that's changing and has been changing. And so the courses, like yours about the health humanities can really help begin that trajectory of incorporating more skills. If you view empathy as a skill, then you can incorporate and build empathy by things through like the arts. There's a sort of a movement within medical education to incorporate narrative medicine, which is similar to the medical humanities. So developing the skill of really being able to listen to a patient. And so there are our own doctors and our own medical students are not doing well health-wise. As physicians, they have a really high rate of dying by suicide, and medical students, to say they're stressed out does not really capture it. Their health outcomes are not good. And so I would like to see a larger focus on helping them before they can help us, especially now that they're going to be expected, especially frontline workers, but even if they're not, they're going to be expected to be faced with additional challenges and risks to their own health, and treating so many people from COVID and related issues, that the first thing we need to do if we expect them to be humanistic is to create structures that protect their own health.
To solve this problem of pandemics, future situations, we need an interdisciplinary approach. And if there's any silver lining to this tragedy, I think it's the realization that we need long-term, big picture research into what the humanities, arts, and social sciences can provide, because we know from our experience, we know intuitively that we provide a lot of value to public health sectors and networks, the individuals, and the entire system. Now we have this opportunity to study it at depth, to document it, and to do it more vigorously in a variety of healthcare settings.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that as the English professor and the humanities and the importance of empathy. But thinking about my own career as someone who has studied English and American literature most of my life, I can't think of anything else, any other discipline. And I'm sure every discipline has different ways to think about this, but I can't think of any other discipline that allows us to experience empathy in ways, any other way. Because when you read about the lives of other people in literature, and you're asked to put, these writers are asking you to put yourselves in the shoes of these people that you're reading about, and to try to understand them, and to try to like them or dislike them, and why you dislike them. I can't think of anything else, any other discipline in my experience that does that, and perhaps that's why I was drawn to literature from the beginning. But it's all you actually started an answer to one of the questions that I have as to why it is important that we're having this conversation. I could have clearly invited people from faculty from other disciplines. We have a limited amount of time, but I wanted to make sure that we looked at it from the perspectives that you heard about now. So from your perspective, thinking about your students and so forth, why is it important that we're having this conversation?
Because I think going back to what I said when I was talking about how social decisions may have biological consequences, I think that that as thinkers in social sciences and humanities and natural sciences, I think we're actually best at problem solving when we come together. So I think that some of the issues that Steve and Kelly have raised, for example, about the vaccine that Bill was talking about, that vaccine uptake, the best vaccine in the whole world could come out of this. And I assume someone is going to get a Nobel Prize for this, right? That the best vaccine, all these great minds are working on this vaccine, but it's not going to help us if people don't take it. And to really understand why people will or will not take it, or whether they will seek out healthcare, in part because of how they're treated, I think you need people who are trained in a lot of different disciplines in order to make that happen, in order to solve big problems.
Okay. I do have some few questions left in the Q&A. For Bill, how do people who are on immune suppression drugs negatively affected by COVID?
Yeah, immune suppressive drugs will make people much more susceptible to severe disease than people who are not on immune suppressive drugs. And so that would be a comorbidity, and it stresses the need for getting to a threshold of herd immunity, because those are the kinds of people that will be protected by herd immunity. And once again, I'm talking about herd immunity that will be a combination of infection and vaccine. So in people who are on immune suppressive drugs often can't take vaccine. Therefore, they remain susceptible, and they're super susceptible. And so it's so important that we explore the interdisciplinary approaches that can lead to good compliance with taking a safe and effective vaccine, so that we can protect those elements of our society through no fault of their own that are extra susceptible.
And so, Bill, another question: can an individual become reinfected? We don't know that yet, right?
We don't know that yet. We have a couple of described cases where that has happened, but I've been surprised somewhat that that more of those have not come up. If it's going to be a very common event from February until now, I would have expected to hear more about it. So I think that the answer is it can happen, but it doesn't appear to be very frequent.
So this is I think a great question that we might be able to end on. So we've talked about these different dimensions here that, Timi, you just so eloquently talked about. So how do we achieve a balance here between in this conversation between the science, the medical risks, the social and economic risks of the disease, and if we are virus-free, yet we're all kind of broken and lonely, as the question puts it, have we won the fight?
As one of the French poets said, this is in translation, of course, my body's in the world, but the world is in my mind. And I think that the continuing re-education and re-edification and resupply of the arts and humanities are so vital at this juncture. We need to help each other find those texts and moments and performances online or whatever it takes that will continue to help us through this challenging time.
I think one of the reasons I like teaching this class is that our students get a chance to see how things have been put back together before.
There you go.
And I think that even if it sounds depressing to some people that we're teaching about these terrible events, there's always hope, because things do come back together.
I think that is a great way to end our conversation. I want to thank all of you for participating in this conversation. Thank you for joining us today. I want to thank all of you for listening to our conversation today. Our next seminar will be held at noon on Wednesday, October 21st, and we will focus on the presidential election. I hope you will join us for that. So thank you very much and have a great day.